Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. What does a Hollywood copyright fight from the 20th century have in common with royal publishing privileges and the French Revolution? More than you might imagine. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. Today's conversation is co-sponsored by Authors Alliance, and you'll be hearing from Executive Director Dave Hanser. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. It is my pleasure to introduce Peter Baldwin and Pamela Samuelson. So first, Pamela Samuelson is the Richard M. Sherman Distinguished Professor of Law and Information at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a pioneer in digital copyright law, intellectual property, cyber law, and information policy. Since 1996, she's held a joint appointment at the Berkeley Law School and UC Berkeley School of Information. And she is a director of the internationally renowned Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. And among my favorite of her many achievements is that she is the co-founder and chair of the board of Authors Alliance. And Pam will be in conversation today with Peter Baldwin. Peter Baldwin is a historian and professor at UCLA. He's the author of The Copyright Wars. I will hand it over to Peter to take it away.
Thank you very much. It's almost 10 years since the book came out. A lot has happened in the meantime, and I'm very flattered to be asked to do this and amazed at the interest and grateful to Pam for being willing to take on this conversation. Of course, Pam, I've been reading your stuff for a long time now, so you're a real player in this field and I'm an outside observer. But what I can bring is possibly a kind of historical perspective to it. If you look back at the history of copyright is today largely the same system everywhere in the world. Term lengths differ slightly among jurisdictions. Fair use is a bit less generous in some places than others. The first sale doctrine doesn't always allow the lending of the same content in all places. But this is fairly minor kinds of differences among the various systems that exist in the world. But this uniformity that we see now was not always true historically. When copyright first began in the early 18th century in England, and then spread from there, copyright was approached very differently in different jurisdictions. The fundamental point of intellectual property and copyright is to accomplish two effectively contradictory goals. First of all, it is to offer creators some guarantee of profiting from their efforts. And to that end, creators are offered a temporary monopoly during which they can exploit their work. But the return on that promise, the return for society, is that once the period of temporary monopoly is over, of course, the work then joins the public domain and is available for anyone to use. Now, that means that copyright is effectively two-faced, and it can go in opposing directions. It can either be focused on the creators and their rewards on the one hand, or it can be focused on the public domain and what the audience expects in the way of having content delivered to it. And depending on how you formulate copyright, it can emphasize one aspect or the other. Now, throughout the 18th century, when copyright first began, these two sets of interests were largely held in balance. Terms were short. At first, they were just 14 years, and only a few kinds of works were protected, mainly writings. But having won this beachhead, creators and their disseminators strove for more. If novels and essays and plays were protected, why not engravings and music? And if these works were protected for 14 years, why not longer? And if they were protected against being reprinted, why not against other uses like translation or abridgment or editing or otherwise being used for derivative works? All these other uses were eventually protected as well, which meant that any such use required permission and payment to the author. So protection lengthened in duration to the point we've arrived at now, where it is basically a life of the author plus 70, and protection broadened in scope to the extent that every conceivable creative act is protected the instant it occurs without having to undertake any formalities of registration or that sort of thing. So it's a huge expansion of rights for the authors in two directions. Now, in this process of expanding, different nations took different approaches depending on whose claims they took most seriously, whether they were most interested in the author's claims or most interested in the audience's claims. And on the whole, looking back historically, It's fair to say, and this is what the bulk of the book deals with, that continental Europe favored the interests of creators and gave them ever longer and broader powers. And this is what I, in the book, call the author's rights tradition. The author's rights tradition regards creators as having a natural law property right in works, which in theory should mean that they own them in perpetuity, but if not perpetually, at least they own them for a very long time. And in contrast to this, we then had the copyright tradition, more narrowly defined, specific use of the term copyright here, which in the 18th and the 19th centuries was adopted basically in the Anglo-Saxon nations, in the UK as well, but above all in the US. And this copyright tradition emphasized the interests of the public in cheap, easily available enlightenment. It argued that authors had no more rights in their works than anyone has natural rights in tangible property. And it's only by virtue of the state policing property rights that they can be enforced at all. And in return for the state enforcing limited rights to exploit their property, authors therefore had to surrender it eventually to the public domain. Now, let me give you just two very brief examples, historical examples, of how the contrast between these traditions worked itself out in practice over the 19th and 20th centuries. During the 19th century, the US refused to grant foreign authors copyright protection at all. That allowed US publishers to print bootleg editions of European writers at cheap prices. The US in the 19th century had the largest literate reading public in the world, and these publishers wanted to exploit. So American editions were massive and they were cheap. Entire novels were published in periodicals. Charles Dickens was serialized on the back of railway train timetables, and effectively, education and enlightenment was spread as cheaply and as widely as possible, thanks to the European authors having no copyright. It was only toward the end of the 19th century that the US finally conceded foreign authors protection. And that happened when some US authors, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, when some of these American authors became popular in Europe, and American publishers discovered what it meant to be the victims of pirated editions. In other words, the change happened, the change to giving European authors copyright protection in the US, the change happened when the US became a cultural exporter and when its publishers shifted interests. The US then took the first of many steps towards the European view of authors' rights that has since come to dominate intellectual property. That's the first example. The second example, and this is from the other side of the spectrum, has to do with moral rights. Moral rights were emblematic of the European approach. Authors were given almost total control over their works. They could prevent them from appearing except precisely as they wanted, and they could prevent works and any uses of their works. In the most extreme case, authors were given a withdrawal right. That is to say, they could withdraw works from the market and forbid their use even after they had been published. In practice, this didn't work out very realistically, but in theory, it was a right that they were granted. So just as one among many examples, in 1954, the French band Carmen Jones, which was the film by Otto Preminger of Bizet's opera Carmen, and the reason they did so was that Bizet's heirs found that Carmen Jones, which was set among Black Americans, they found this to be a setting that was unworthy of the now dead master. Now, these sorts of contrasts between, on the one hand, the author's rights tradition and the copyright tradition peaked during the middle decades of the 20th century. And since that time, the two sides, the Anglo-Saxon nations and the European continental nations, have begun to approximate each other, largely in tune with how the Anglo-Saxons have adopted the author's rights approach. This change was driven, above all, because the U.S. content industries eventually became the world's biggest cultural exporters during the latter half of the 20th century, and they therefore developed an interest in strong protection for their property, much as the Europeans had earlier in this period that we're looking at. The Google Books project demonstrates that this transatlantic divergence still exists, even though it has been moderated. When Google presented its plans in 2004, the European reaction to it was hostile. Authors' rights were being violated. This was the European position. The Anglophone cultural Moloch was seen as once again trying to dominate the world. And we can also see a sort of resonance of this dispute in the discussions over the safe harbors provisions of how content that is posted on the web is treated. Safe harbors give content disseminators some protection against claims of infringement for the works that they post, and the EU is now in the process of clamping down on these kinds of liability exceptions, while in the US, the debate about this has only just begun. And that brings us to the question of open access, because if you look at the historical trajectory, you might expect there to be a broader divergence on open access between Europe and America than, in fact, there seems to be. In theoretical terms, it's true that the debate over open access was started earlier and in many ways conducted much more fervently in the US, but in practical terms, the Europeans seem to have beaten the US in the race. The EU has by now passed an orphan works law that allows orphan works to be digitized, for example, even though at the same time it demands payments for authors. And of course, Plan S, which mandates gold open access for academic research, is a European initiative that has gotten fairly widespread support in Europe, though not uniformly and only to some extent in this country. So an interesting question, and I won't try to answer it now, I'd leave that for the discussion. Instead is, given this historical trajectory with the two divergent approaches to copyright, why is it that with open access, in fact, the gulf seems to have narrowed somewhat and the two sides have reached some kind of rapprochement? So let me stop there for fear of monopolizing what time we have.
I want to start by saying thank you, Peter, for writing that book. I think while I have been familiar with a good part of the history of the copyright wars, there were so many details about those, the ways in which the copyright has been, from my standpoint, misused that I didn't know about. You've given me a lot of examples to work with, and so thank you for that. But also, I think, as Brewster suggested, so many of us think that the copyright wars of the modern era are completely new, and I think you have done such a good job in helping us understand that, hey, this has been going on for hundreds of years. And, you know, it waxes and wanes back and forth. And we are in today a little bit of a lull. But as somebody who was a very active participant in the copyright wars in the 1990s, I can tell you that for those of you who were just in junior high school at that point, that was actually really hard fought. And the Clinton administration in 1994, 1995 would have had copyright essentially so broad that the internet would practically have to be shut down. So every temporary and every permanent copy of works would be within the exclusive rights of the rights holder. ISPs would be strictly liable for every infringing copy of every infringing work that might be on their system. And there would be no need for fair use because everything could be licensed. And that was the picture that not only the Clinton administration supported, but also there was a draft international treaty, the WIPO Copyright Treaty in 1996. The draft treaty would have made all of those exclusive rights expansions into an international norm. Now, this is actually a good example that fighting back against the high protectionists can sometimes be successful. And so the WIPO Copyright Treaty that finally got adopted in 1996 was actually a pretty good one. So they dropped the temporary copy as a norm. They dropped the ISP's strict liability rule. And the WIPO Copyright Treaty not only said you can continue to use the exceptions that are in your national copyright law now, but also new exceptions that can be added. So this was actually a place where some of the U.S. representatives to the WIPO Treaty, some of the Nordic nations, some Africa, and some from Asia got together and said, hey, this high protectionist international treaty draft, we don't want any part of it. And so this was actually a place where there was something of a victory. Now, I do, when it comes to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, We didn't win everything, but the ISP safe harbors has been enormously important to the growth of the internet economy and allowing the hosting of content on sites, everything from YouTube to WordPress. And we're very happy that the DMCA safe harbors has not only protected the interests of the platforms that provide this space, but also has enabled users to be able to make fair uses, and the platforms don't have to take anything down until and unless the copyright owner identifies what works have been infringed, and then the platforms have a responsibility to investigate and take it down if the claim is solid. But it does seem to me that the DMCA wasn't perfect. I hate the anti-circumvention rules, but even they have been modified considerably because Congress put in a provision that allows the Copyright Office essentially to grant new exemptions to the anti-circumvention laws. And so for enabling print-disabled access to works, and most recently, Authors Alliance helped to get an exception for text and data mining. So we can basically, digital humanities scholars can now do text and data mining on DVD movies and on ebooks, even though they're technically protected. So there are some good things that have resulted from these wars, but unfortunately the wars are not over.
Pamela, I wonder if your description of the DMCA and the Millennium Copyright Act and the battles over that highlight something that, from a sort of longer historical perspective, is one of the key aspects to copyright and the hopes for channeling reform in the right direction. And that is that there really aren't very many unified actors in this game, or rather there are a lot of actors with different interests. So even authors don't have a single voice, because you have what one might call primary authors who create something ab ovo all by themselves and who think that they own it and they deserve rights for it. But then, of course, you have derivative authors who, librettists, film directors, playwrights, etc., who use other authors' works and want to have free access and want to be able to make use of them in much the same way that the audience does. So already there, with derivative authors, a halfway step between the primary authors and the audience. And nowadays, with postmodern reception theory, and so for the audience becomes a creator in its own right and also has an interest in using the work. So even the authors category isn't unified, and nor, of course, is that of the disseminators, because you have the disseminators who publish, to stick with books, the primary authors, and they share more or less the same interests as the primary authors. But then you have the reprint publishers in the 19th century who are desperate just to put out as much stuff as they possibly can at as cheap a price as you can. And during the battles over the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that split was effectively reenacted in the split between, on the one hand, Hollywood and the content owners and producers, and on the other hand, the internet interests in Silicon Valley, the ones who disseminated the information and didn't want it locked down, effectively reflected the same split that you had in the 19th century between the primary publishers and the reprint publishers. And so this civil war that you effectively had between Northern California and Southern California was what allowed what prevented the Clinton administration. You remember how buddy Clinton was with Hollywood. It prevented the Clinton administration from steamrolling that through without getting precisely things like safe harbors, which is effectively the mechanism by which the content owners and the content disseminators have been reconciled to each other.
I very much agree with you that the interests of authors are not uniform, nor are the interests of disseminators, but there are, as you say, some loud voices there. One of the reasons why I was motivated to co-found Authors Alliance was because it really made me angry when the Authors Guild, which is made up of mostly people who want to commercialize their works, and I think that organization has every right to exist, but they would basically say, hey, we represent the interests of all authors. And so when they brought these lawsuits, first against Google for the Google Books scanning program, and then against HathiTrust, the digital library of library copies that libraries got back from Google copies of the works that Google had copied from their collections, they were basically saying, oh, we represent the interests of all authors. And I said, no, you don't. And so I filed a couple of briefs, actually, with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, one claiming that you shouldn't actually grant the class action status that Authors Guild was seeking. And second, that Authors Alliance has members who want their works to be found. And Google Books allows people to find our works, and therefore that should be part of the reason why this is fair use. And I'm pleased to say that although that was another very hotly fought debate, that we were able to persuade the Second Circuit to vacate the class action status, and also we helped persuade them that it was fair use for Google to scan this for text and data mining purposes, and to enable search through the snippets that they serve up to people who are searching for something about Buffalo, New York, or something else. So it's been exciting to see that if you guys take some action, sometimes it really can make a big difference in the world. And I think that Peter's book gives us a reason to think that this is an ongoing struggle, but we're in a pretty good space at the moment. Not a great one, but a pretty good one. And Peter, I very much agree with you about the divergence between Europe and the US. And I agree with you also that there's been some significant convergence, and the US has moved more toward the European approach. But fair use is actually an example of a concept that Europeans have yet to swallow. At least some of the academics I know would like fair use to happen, but so far not really happening. And the Europeans are clamping down now through new directives and new regulations. There was about a 20-year period in which the US and the EU both adopted the safe harbor approach. And now the Europeans are saying that just allowed too much infringement to happen, so we're not going to let that happen anymore. The divergence has gotten more significant, and it's going to be interesting to see whether that leads to more legislative activity in the US. So far, not, but maybe it's in the early stages of transition.
This is one of those issues where once one is in favor of some political inertia and nothing changing, in our case, but in the case of the US. But so you raise an interesting question here. Again, broadening this issue of the splits among creators and their divergent interests. We take this into the open access field, which is a topic of more recent interest. This is the big third rail issue that often doesn't come up, because the moral argument for open access is really nothing other than for those authors who have been paid already in another form for your work, especially if you've been paid by taxpayers, which is the case for almost all scientific and certainly all academic researchers. There's no particular reason why you should be paid again for selling the product of what you've already been paid to do in the first place. So the division now becomes not between primary and derivative authors, it becomes between academic authors on the one hand, for whom open access is, to me, it seems to me, a moral imperative, and all the freelancers, or whatever we want to call them, independent authors who actually have an ambition, whether realized or not, to live from their work, for whom, as far as I can see, there is no good moral argument to be made that they should open up their work, nor any economic logic as to how they should be able to do it. There are obviously, of course, public interest arguments, networking arguments, and usefulness to the audience and all that sort of thing. Obviously, it'd be great if every novelist made their novels freely available, but I just don't see the moral argument there. Society might be better if that were the case, but I don't see how one could go to people who expect to live from their work or want to try to live from their work and tell them they have to open it. So the new divide that's opened up is between academia on the one hand and independent cultural producers on the other. And the odd thing is, and I talk about this in my new book at some length, academia is not at all particularly in favor of open access, or at least not nearly as in favor of it as it ought to be. And when I say academia, I mean in particular humanities and social sciences here, because scientists, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And science is on the way to becoming fully open access, and in another 10 years max, it will be. And there's no particular secret as to why that's the case. They have the funding to do it. It costs 2% of research costs to make articles and whatever books the scientists write open access. It's a rounding error for them. in terms of funding. But for the humanities and social sciences, of course, it's a major issue. And those scholars are not the ones who are leading the fight for open access as they ought to be. If anything, they're in the arriere guard and bringing up the rear, grumbling all the way as they're dragged into the open access future. And it's a very interesting sort of dispute to see a group of people, my peers and colleagues, who want to be on the right side of things, but who aren't.
I think that's exactly right. The humanities scholars and the social science scholars, I think more humanities than social science, at least in my experience. There are people in some of the social science fields who embrace open access. One problem has been that the scholarly societies have supported themselves through exclusive rights that they get from authors who publish in their journals. And since those journals very often are the high prestige journals where I have to place my work in this particular journal in order to be able to be sure to get tenure. And the scholarly society says, you got to give me your copyright. And they have to pay the salaries of the staff through that. So that's another one of the impediments. So I don't think at least some of the social science scholars are fighting open access so much as they are like, we're trapped, right? We're trapped because of the need to be in these journals. And as long as those journals are basically proprietary, we feel trapped. So it's been especially difficult for those people to find their way to open access. But even I think that there are now efforts in some of those fields anyway to open up a little bit more. Now, one thing that we haven't mentioned, but I think is worth mentioning, is that open access has actually provided some competition in the copyright space that didn't exist before. And it's provided an opportunity for especially scholarly authors who publish their monographs. They're now able to negotiate often with their publishers that, hey, we're going to have a 5-year window in which the book is basically available for purchase only. But after that, because usually that 5 years, 3 to 5 years is the window in which, generally speaking, people are able to essentially enjoy the fruits of copyright. But after that, we can make it available on an open access basis. And so that's been something I think that has been a leverage for authors that they didn't used to have. And I think that's been a good thing. Now, one thing that I wanted to highlight here, and this is the latest skirmish in the copyright wars, and that's the fight over controlled digital lending. As many of the publishers of popular books want to make their books available digitally only through licensing and only in highly restricted formats. And so it seems to me that one of the things that the libraries have been able to do is not be able to purchase these ebooks and lend them the way that the books have been lent traditionally by libraries, but they've been experimenting with controlled digital lending. And the Internet Archive was the sort of the instigator of this particular initiative, which has been picked up by many libraries and endorsed by a number of scholars as well as other people. And that allows, if you own a physical copy of a book, then you can scan that book and lend the digital copy, and you have to do it. You can't digitally lend more copies than you actually own. And when somebody does a digital lend, it only lasts for 2 weeks, and also it's technically protected so that you can't make further copies of it. And this is an effort to essentially accomplish lending by libraries the way that they've traditionally been able to do. But Hachette and several other publishers have sued the Internet Archive over this, and this will be the big fair use battle of the decade.
Yes, no, we all await the outcome on tenterhooks to see because it will make a huge difference in terms of what the strategy will be going forward. If there's a loss here, that would be quite significant. Even more outrageous if we look at digital editions and libraries, is the way in which publishers force libraries to pay more for the digital editions that they lend than the retail consumer. And of course, the library's argument is a library owns a physical copy of a book, and after it's been lent X number of times, it gets tattered and they have to buy a new one. And so they build into these library licensing arrangements, you can lend it X number of times and then you have to pay again. Or if you want a permanent copy that you don't have to renew all the time, you have to pay often 3 and 4 times the retail price of it. But of course, there's a lot of dispute as to how long does a physical book actually last in a library's hands. And the publishers will tell you 12 lens and it's gone, and the libraries will tell you 112 lens and it's still there. And so obviously there's a lot of back and forth there. But it's almost as though the logic of the publishers is if they want to be paid per lend, not per book. And if the car manufacturers were to sell their cars according to the same logic, if you sell a car to a family with 4 children, it's going to cost more than if you sell it to a bachelor, which makes very little sense in the modern capitalist market. So there's some other dispute there that has to be ironed out, and clearly we're far from having achieved any resolution.
And unfortunately, even though there have been some states that have passed laws that are consumer protection laws that try to regulate the way in which digital ebooks are licensed, publishers go after that and say, oh, that's preempted by copyright law. We have this exclusive right. Authors Alliance is hoping to work with other organizations to try to figure out what consumer protection rules we can promote that would not get preempted, because it seems to me that the idea that libraries of the future are all digital, right? For a lot of my students, if it in digital form, it might as well not exist. And the future of libraries is really at stake in cases like the Hachette lawsuit against the Internet Archive. And I think that Internet Archive's lawyers are doing a very good job trying to help the court see the bigger picture here. But again, Authors Alliance represents the interests of authors who basically say, hey, we like libraries. Libraries are really important to us, and access to the cultural heritage of humanity is something that libraries enable, and we need that to continue to exist. Hopefully, the courts will see that this isn't about theft. This isn't about piracy. This is about access to cultural heritage, which the Constitution in the United States basically says this is supposed to be about promoting the progress of science and useful arts, as to say about promoting access to knowledge. And the Supreme Court, at least so far, has basically said that the interest of the public in access to works is the primary goal of copyright, not the reward to authors and not to have exclusive control over everything.
That you raised the elephant in the room question as far as libraries is concerned, because once everything is digitized, what role exactly are they going to play? You think about when I was a teenager and desperately wanted access to more music, more than I could afford. I once lived for a while in a jurisdiction where it was considered okay for libraries to lend music. You could go and lend records. That's not the case everywhere. They were, of course, old and scratchy and a little bit better than nothing, but not by much. But that was the technology of the day that sort of determined that. But in most places, of course, you can't do that. But now, fast forward, 40 years, and between Apple Music and Spotify, effectively, whatever role libraries might have played in the dissemination of music has been completely sidestepped, and they play absolutely zero role. And the private sector has arranged that all very nicely, and apparently to the satisfaction of the average consumer. And the question, is something similar going to happen to books, where we just, sidestep the libraries altogether?
I think libraries have a big role to play in the future. At least I'm a big believer in that. It seems to me that I'm not the only one who actually really likes physical books and likes to be in a place where you can actually look at the stacks and see what other books are next to this one. And that's a little harder to do in digital form. You more or less have to know what you're looking for. And this kind of serendipity of the actual physical library, I think, is an important function that is played, but also as a community center, right? At least when I was growing up, there would be readings, right? There would be events where the libraries could be a community space. And I think that space is still quite valuable. And again, for authors, it was a way of enabling a wider readership for their work. And that function, I think, would continue to exist. But again, a lot of what the publishers would like is you have to subscribe to my silo, right? These are my books, and you license not just the book that you want, but you license all of the books in my stack. And then when you get used to that, I'll take out the ones that are the most popular. So you're still paying for the silo, but I'm taking out the ones that are popular, and you're going to have to license those differently. And Wiley tried to do that this year by taking out some of the books that were licensed to universities, and where right before the start of the semester, I was assigning this particular book, but now my students have to buy it separately rather than having it within the license silo. And I'm proud of Authors Alliance for having worked with others to try to say, hey, that's really unfair. And to do it right before the start of the semester when people have already planned their curriculum. So Wiley basically backed off. But that's an example of, even when you license something, they can basically change the terms and change what the product is, just like that. And you have no recourse.
Yeah, no, I realize I'm not going to make any friends by saying critical things about libraries in this crowd. And far be it for me, I've spent most of my adult life in libraries and relied on them heavily. I have nothing bad to say about libraries. I do think we have to think about what the future of libraries is. And there's some hard truths there that they are going to be very different than what they are today.
Peter, Pam, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. We are very close to time. Peter, I don't know if you have any last parting words that you'd like to add.
Only that I suspect the battle will continue. Whatever rapprochement there has been, as Pamela has pointed out, it's not as though there's a unanimity. And in this particular case, it seems to me we're on the right side of history, and I hope we prevail.
I hope so too. That's a great way to end.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.